Idle Days in St. Augustine by Frank H. Sweet. This was published in Peterson's Magazine in December of 1891. Approaching the ancient city from Jacksonville, one is impressed unfavorably by the dreary flat expanse of country, much of which is covered by a thin sheet of water. An occasional elevation is almost certain to have every available rod dotted with stakes indicating house lots for sale. A few small buildings which afford shelter to the workmen are shown as the nucleus of the future city. As the name is called out by the brakeman, we start a little and cast another glance from the window. Very likely we have an elaborate map and prospectus of the place in our pocket and have been wondering if it is not one of the chances of our lifetime. On the journey down, we pass three of these enterprising places whose names are familiar to us. They have required several columns of the Jacksonville papers for weeks past to canvass their merits. Doubtless, we have been on the point of buying many times, and were only deterred by the difficulty of choosing among so many. But the dreary journey renders quaint, picturesque St. Augustine even more alluring by contrast and force. During the winter season, the hotels are usually full, and even the Minorcan inhabitants let every available room and nook to lodgers. Prices are exorbitant, and if one is not abundantly supplied with funds, he can save money and fare just as well by taking rooms and procuring his meals at a restaurant. A few days at the Magnolia convinced me that the rates and my funds would assimilate too rapidly for future prospects, and I began diligently to seek quarters elsewhere. At length I became settled at Bay Cottage on Marine Street, and found myself one of the most of about 20 guests who hailed from all over Brazil, Australia, Canada, Dakota. All were ready with stories. None had anything to do, and one, a miner from Colorado, who said he was on a time, was perpetually planning excursions, and what was more to the purpose, always insisted on paying all of the expenses. And a dreamy, lazy St. Augustine was a paradise for easy-going excursionists. No one thought of rising early, and the first duty after breakfast was to lounge up St. George Street to the plaza, and selecting a cozy corner in the slave market, or under some of the palms, or under tropical trees, wait for the dark-skinned Minorcan newsboys. When the post office opened at 9 o'clock, a general stampede was made in that direction, and presently the crowd surged back with letters and papers. The plaza was the great morning attraction. It took the place of the casino of a fashionable watering place, or the quarterdeck of a vessel. Here everybody walked and gossiped, loitered, and dreamed to his heart's content. And there was much subject matter for dreaming. Every foot of ground was charged with romantic stories of the days of French and Spanish domain, of the pillaging of the English sea king Drake, the massacres by the buccaneers, and tales of the Franciscan missionaries and the Seminole Indians. The town is very small, lying between Fort Marion and the barracks in one direction, and the seawall and St. Sebastian River in the other. About 3/4 of 1 mile, that is to say. It is built almost entirely of coconut, a curious conglomerate of shells and fragments of all forms and colors. The streets are very narrow, and in the old days, with 2 or 3 exceptions, were used exclusively for pedestrians. But now the hack drivers, and they plunge recklessly into such streets as are wide enough to receive their carriages, and luckless pedestrians must seek safety in flight or some convenient doorway. St. George, the principal street, is wide enough for a carriage, but not for a carriage and sidewalk, so on muddy days there is always a constant warfare between curiosity seekers and the Jehus. Treasury Street, however, is safe from their encroachments. The overhanging balconies almost touch, and persons standing against the walls on opposite sides of the street can very comfortably shake hands. The houses are generally far enough apart to allow for good-sized gardens, and are shut in from the gaze of pedestrians by high walls. But occasionally one finds the lattice gate open and catches a glimpse of waving palms and majestic bananas, and all luxuriant foliage of an exotic garden. There are few, if any, Spaniards here now. The inhabitants are mostly Minorcans, whose ancestors originally came from the island of the same name. From the plaza to the barrier gateway, St. George Street is a constant succession of stores and shops, and each is but a repetition of the other, only differing in arrangements and quantity of stock displayed. Alligators' teeth and endless varieties of manufacture, boar's tusks in gold and silver, fish scales, jewelry, sea beans, sea fans, a profusion of shells, and the thousands and one curiosities that go towards emptying the tourist's pocket and weighing his already overburdened trunks. Some of the fish scale jewelry is especially beautiful, and one wonders at the exquisite combination and blending of the tints. A little investigation shows that nearly every inhabitant of the city is engaged in the manufacture of curiosities. A small army of men make good wages as polishers of beans and alligators' teeth. Others do the mounting and selling, and teeth originally worth about 50 cents per hundred are made by skillful artists to represent several dollars each. And while the fathers and brothers are engaged at their turning lathes, some of the daughters will be making the exquisite palmetto hats that lady tourists always long to possess. Others will be painting local scenes on seashells, while still others tastefully work the soft tinted fish scales into rare and wonderful combinations of color and beauty. There are few households in the city, of the working class anyways, that do not follow curio manufacture in some of its branches. After one begins buying it, it's hard to know when to stop. There is always something a little more curious or beautiful or rare that attracts the eye, and there is always some friend who would, one is certain, be delighted therewith. One day after my intended stay of a few days had lengthened into several months, a vessel came in from the Bahamas with a cargo of curiosities which must have seriously taxed both sea and land to furnish. Every available space about the vessel was full of them, and visitors had difficulty in moving around the deck even. The captain, his family, and the crew all became salesmen, and everybody was invited to buy, no matter how small the investment. It was very curious to watch the swarthy salesmen as they exhibited the heaps of shells, grasses, skins, sea vegetables, tortoise shells, strange plants, fossils, coral, sponge, freaks of land and sea, in strange varieties of shape and color, their broken English often becoming unintelligible in their eagerness to sell all. The sale lasted nearly a week, and I think all St. Augustine must have attended. There was a constant stream of people going and coming, ladies from the hotels, all the curio dealers, and swarms of ragged urchins watching for a chance, surreptitiously, to sample the fruit scattered lavishly about. As fast as the deck was cleared, new lots were brought from the hold and sold at private sale, auctioned, traded, consigned to dealers, or sent on shore to be sold by boys. The captain was very accommodating. If anyone wanted to buy, he would meet him more than halfway and sell on almost any terms. There was no uniform price. Each salesman sold for all he could get, but took care that each article was disposed of for something. By the time the cargo was sold, I doubt if there was a person in the city but had a specimen of it. Among other things, I purchased 3 coconut trees for 75 cents. The sprouts were 3 or 4 feet high, growing from the nuts, which as yet showed no sign of roots. They were very handsome, and I was assured they would live for months without planting. But a very few days convinced me I had no possible use for them, and they were consigned to the street. As I grew more familiar with the picturesque city and its surroundings, my intention of a short stay was abandoned, and I gave myself up to the enjoyment of the place. Bay Cottage fronted the water, and directly opposite was St. Anastasia Island, a favorite resort for excursion parties. There were many attractions here. The magnificent lighthouse from which a far extended view is afforded over land and sea, the charming footpath through tropical shrubbery and palm trees, the ruins of the old Spanish lookout from which was discovered the approach of Francis Drake, or Oglethorpe, and of the buccaneers from the Spanish Main. Nor less interesting, the Cacuna Ledge and wrecks strewn shore. North Beach, nearly opposite, is another popular place for excursionists, and about the only place where really good specimens of shells can be found. There are many tales of buried treasure connected with the beach, and the visitor is haunted with visions of Spanish buccaneers and wrecked galleons with silver ingots and golden doubloons. One day, while I was at Bay Cottage, some little girl who was playing on the beach found several large coins, much worn and defaced by the action of the waves, but legible enough for the coin experts to decide that they did not know them. Straightway there was an excitement, which spread from our hotel over the entire city. The little girl had located the spot of some ancient wreck, and for a week treasure hunters dug and redug the sand, but alas, no more coins were discovered. After one had passed through the barrier gateway, almost the only relic of elaborate system of fortifications which once defended the town, the first object of interest is Fort Marion. Many an afternoon have I passed in the old northeast tower with a book or newspaper, the city and all the surroundings of land and sea spread out before me, and the breeze coming cool and delicious through the casements. It was well adapted to dreaming away in an afternoon, cool, retired, and full of historic associations. The very walls of the old tower were covered with the names of visitors, scratched and in some cases chiseled into the shell. They represented several generations and were from nearly all quarters of the world. Passing into the fort over the drawbridge in Barbican, we find that half a day may pleasantly be spent in examining the dark rooms, dungeons, and court, and making ourselves familiar with casements, glacis, bastions, moat, and the many curious things which belong to an ancient fortress. If visitors are sufficiently interested, the conductor shows the hidden dungeons which had been walled up but were accidentally discovered after the fort came into the possession of the United States some 50 old years ago. The guide tells the story of the skeletons and chains and gold ring found among the rubbish, and of the instruments of torture, the iron cages, and sends his listeners home to dream of the old Spanish Inquisition tales with a new horror. In one of these dark corner dungeons, the Charleston patriots were confined by the British during the Revolution. In another cell, the Spaniards kept the famous outlaw McGirth for 5 years. In another cell, Cacucci, the friend of Osceola, was confined and made the casement forever famous by escaping from it. And so on from cell to cell and court to bastion we were taken, until our heads were a strange jumble of massacres and dark tales of horror. Toward evening, the plaza has to divide its honors with the seawall. It is the favorite promenade of the place, and is used even more than the road is going back and forth between the city and Fort Marion. It is just wide enough for two to walk abreast, and affords a charming prospect of all the sail-dotted harbor, the shining sand dunes of North Beach, and the luxuriant green of Anastasia, with the lighthouse rising against the sky.